Welcome back to another episode of Shaping eCommerce with Ironplane. I'm Tim Bucciarelli. I'm the Director of Engagement with Ironplane. And today I'm very pleased to have Damien Retzinger with us to talk about the future of e-commerce. We've done several interviews on this topic, and Damien is here to give his point of view for all of our merchants out there about the future of e-commerce from his point of view. And I'll let him give a quick intro, and then we'll dive right in.
Hi, I'm Damien. I'm the owner of a small Magento Adobe Commerce agency called Graycore. I myself am a software engineer, so I've been doing software about 12, 15 years now. I'm the maintainer of Mage-OS, which is a fork of Magento. I am a maintainer of Faker.js, which is a really large JavaScript library for generating fake data. And I am a BDFL or pseudo maintainer, kind of like maintainer god of Angular PWA framework for e-commerce called Daffodil.
Okay, so if I didn't understand some of those points, I'm sure a lot of our listeners haven't understood them. I know what a maintainer and that role is. We will touch on Mage-OS a little bit later in this conversation because I think it's a critical component of one of our questions. What is BDFL, just out of curiosity?
So it stands for Benevolent Dictator for Life. It is. It's typically if it's something that you're really committed to, it's something that you like doing a lot. So, for example, Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux, has often been called the BDFL of Linux. Same thing with the creator of Python. So many people.
Yeah. Okay.
People who build cool things.
And there were probably several BDFLs in the past on Magento when it was truly open source. Is that correct?
I think there have been a lot of chief architects, but I would say not nearly as many. If we want to go all the way back down to like the Varian days, I don't think so. I think there were architects and there were groups of people, but I don't think there's ever like one clear driving vision.
Okay. Well, we'll get into that a little bit later. But so your background is as a developer in various areas. Would it be safe to say that Magento is one of the core areas that you've been working in over the years?
Yeah, I've been doing Magento since 1.6, so it's been around 12 years. So I graduated from university and my first job was building a Magento store.
Okay. And currently your agency continues to build websites for clients who come to you specifically for the Magento platform, or do you work in other platforms as well?
So we work in a number of different platforms, but primarily Magento is our focus area. So we've done some Shopify builds. We've done one not so fantastic Shopware build, but primarily Magento and Adobe Commerce. So both the CE and the EE license.
Yep. Okay, great. All right. So when we're talking about the future of e-commerce, we always start with one very broad question, and you can go with it wherever you'd like. Where do you see the future of e-commerce in the next 5 to 10 years?
It's a really good question. I think generally speaking, we're going to see historically, like there's been a lot of different players, right? So you have a lot of different players. But these days, the ecosystem has stratified, right? So you have your companies that serve the small market, companies that serve the mid-market, and companies that serve the kind of the upper echelon. I would assume we're going to see consolidation of a lot of companies. I don't know exactly how that's going to happen, but I would assume there's going to be some sort of consolidation. And just like we have Apple and Microsoft and Linux as the various competitions for operating systems, I would assume we're going to see the same exact kind of thing for e-commerce platforms. There's too much complexity to have so many different ones, and as a result, over time, we'll end up with somewhat of an oligopoly.
I'm not sure if that strikes me as a good thing, to be honest with you. I think, well, when you think about Linux, I kind of think about Linux because that's very unique. Like when you think about Windows, everyone knows what Windows is. When you talk about Apple, when you talk about Google, like those massive organizations that control so much of the internet today, Linux is a little bit unique because it's really on its own, and it's more open than the others. Yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about that. If we end up with these massive companies kind of managing the major e-commerce pillars, will there be a Linux, and will it kind of keep everyone on their toes? I guess that's kind of what I feel.
I would assume so. So I have oft of late been saying that Magento is the Linux kernel of e-commerce. It's one of the only platforms that I know in e-commerce that has probably 100,000 different developers contributing to it over its lifetime. The fact that it's open source is one of its huge selling points because of the variety of use cases that have been built into it over the years by all of the developers who have used it. Things like Shopify or things like BigCommerce, while they come from a great place and they serve their markets really well, and they have the opportunity to solve a lot of different problems, the contributing engineers don't exist in the different domains. So as a result, I would argue that they're going to be somewhat limited in their perspective. They'll focus on a certain scope, whereas I think Magento can serve a much broader audience.
That's been our experience as well, and that's why Ironplane has been focused on Magento since 2008 or 9, I think. We also work with BigCommerce because we understand that we want to serve a larger portion of merchants, and some merchants actually who were on Magento 1 and migrated to Magento 2 are struggling to maintain their code base with all the updates and the patches. And so BigCommerce, and I'm sure you feel the same way with Shopify, BigCommerce was a nice way to offer a transition if we are approached with the company that says, look, we've been on Magento for 8 years and we just can't continue to spend $5,000 a month trying to maintain it and optimize it. We just want to go with SaaS. And so we introduced them to BigCommerce. Definitely they're going to be missing out on some functionality, some customization that they might have had, but it's more approachable for them on a fixed cost month by month, and less headache, I guess I'd say. So we've already touched on Shopify, BigCommerce. You mentioned Shopware in the intro. Maybe if you can give us a quick rundown of your view on several different platforms, maybe touch on any particular use cases you think they fulfill or satisfy, and any particular information you'd like to talk about any of those platforms would be helpful.
Yeah. So generally speaking, I kind of have a philosophy about kind of open source software, which I think applies here. So open source software tends to work for small businesses, and I'm talking something in the $0 to $30 million a year range of revenue, approximate. And then open source also works for the really big companies, things that are in the billions of dollars of revenue a year. The things in between is where the question marks lie, and that's kind of where I would argue there's some consideration for various platforms. So I would say in the super micro products, the super micro businesses, Magento may work for you, but Magento, generally speaking, has a cost of ownership. It is, you have to upgrade it. Developers are hard to find. There's a lot of little problems, but if you are a kind of a more technical person, if you're willing to hack around just like you would with Linux, you can get something built and it would work for you. And you're willing and able to maintain it. So it works for like those really small companies. For those who are not interested in that, who don't have the wherewithal to do that, my personal recommendation would be Shopify, because it's really painless to just spin up a store and sell whatever you would like. You can get up and running on a store in like 6 hours, but it comes at a cost. And the cost is really customization. For a super small niche business who's trying to be an upstart, they're trying to break into a new market, something like Shopify might not necessarily work for you, because you might not be able to do something that's different than the broad strokes that Shopify can give you the ability to do. And that's where something like Magento, where you have an open source product where you have full customizability, might come into play. That's, I think, where that comes into play. Once you get past like the $1 million a year mark, that's when the other products start to compete with one another. So BigCommerce is an opportunity here. Shopify can be an opportunity here, and in fact is for many businesses. It's just kind of like natural growth curve. You're already on Shopify, you stay on
Shopify Plus, I guess.
Yeah. So the natural growth curve. You'll get into maybe Shopify starts to hit some problems, and you can't do everything that you want to do. It doesn't integrate with this platform. You need to write some custom code, or it becomes harder to maintain for whatever reason. So you decide to look around. You'll run into Shopware, because that's much like Magento. It's open source, it's customizable. You'll run into Magento, of course. You probably will look at BigCommerce because maybe you want to stick with SaaS and you want to see, does this other platform have some of the integrations that I want to run with? That's the progression. And then you're going to do that for a while. But then you're going to hit the really, really big companies, the companies that are in the billions of dollars, and they're going to have ridiculously complicated problems. They could be operational problems, they could be security constraints, they could be development constraints on many different things. You have globalization problems. I want to run stores that are basically the same and all around the globe. I need this team in this country to maintain this thing, so on and so forth. So you want to kind of get global operations. And that's where things like Magento really start to shine, right? Because then you have full control of the platform. You can create replication. You can do all sorts of fun stuff. And that's where those things really, really show themselves. That's where I think Magento also serves a role. Up at that upper end of the market, you also have Adobe Commerce, you have Salesforce, you have, so Adobe Commerce Cloud, you have Salesforce Commerce Cloud, you have
SAP.
SAP, other
Oracle,
many.
kind of still.
I think they decided to close Oracle Commerce. I don't actually know. I heard something
I think
about
the writing's on the wall. I don't think it's actually been said or done, but that seems to be the trajectory.
There's even some companies that are still running, like HCL, right? So there are some companies doing that as well.
I've heard of other ones like Spryker. I've heard of Kibo Commerce. I've heard of Commerce Tools, of course. We'll touch on that probably a little bit.
Yeah, so that's really when you start to hit like the upper end of the market where you have more complicated problems. You can also hit those problems sooner. So we can talk about composability and headless things. But eventually you'll start to hit some of those problems, and that's my broad stroke spectrum of the market.
And so in that context, when you think about SaaS platforms, why would SaaS be preferred by some businesses? What is it about SaaS that makes it more attractive to some businesses and less attractive to others?
It's really in the customizability. Non-SaaS platforms allow you to change the logical rules about how your product works. A SaaS platform, someone has dictated the rules to you and you must operate within those constraints. You get some benefits, right? So the benefits of SaaS are it's cheaper, right? So you and all the other companies that are operating on that SaaS platform get to work within the constraints, and therefore you get an efficiency bonus and you get some cost reduction. So maybe that's that you require less developers, or maybe you don't even need a developer, but you still have to pay some monthly fee because you have to maintain the platform. It's not your platform. You don't have to worry about outages, et cetera, et cetera. Not your business, not your problem. And that works for a lot of merchants, but there are many merchants where there is some custom requirement. A great example that I have is a merchant that I work with sells alcohol. They have complex alcohol like requirements. You can't just ship alcohol wherever you want. And there's some requirements with that. So a SaaS platform didn't solve that need for them. So they had to go a different route. They had to go with Magento because that fits a need of theirs.
Yeah. And I also, I think I remember something also. It's not just the front end that's customizable to your needs in the Magento platform. I found that a lot of the kind of untapped benefit of a platform like Magento is in the admin area, where you can really look at your internal operations for product management, for catalog management, for pick, pack, and ship operations. And there are ways that you can customize your admin area to really help your teams be much more efficient in what they're doing, whether it's printing out your pick lists differently or barcodes or anyway. I just feel like that's another area that you can customize to your needs, which again, in a SaaS platform, you would be more limited.
You definitely are more limited, but just like you can build out, so Shopify is a great example of this. Just like you can build out a front end for your customers to use, Shopify also has a GraphQL API for the back end. So if you wanted to build a custom UI for your operations staff with Shopify, you could very well do that as well. You are limited to whatever APIs already exist at Shopify. If you need to build some kind of third-party integration, you're going to start writing your own custom code anyway. So maybe Shopify is not a great need for that, but for those companies where you just want something that's fluid, maybe you have like a small terminal that is very, very simple sitting somewhere in your ops department, and you just want to be able to tap the button and it does whatever it's supposed to do.
Yeah.
That could be a use case for Shopify, but that's not limited to SaaS versus something like an open source customizable platform. There are, if we want to think about it like that, I think there are like three main areas. You have like the admin UI, you have the backend, which is like all of the crazy complex logic which makes up your system, and all of the different services and things that you integrate with. And then you have the front end UI, which is what serves your customers. I think the main difference for a SaaS platform is the logical stuff sitting behind the UI. It's the capabilities of that particular platform which are distinct to that platform. The problem is for something like a SaaS platform, if you need a new capability, you might not be able to build it, right? You might have to do some crazy complicated thing in order to get it to work. Whereas something like an open source platform like Magento or something like Shopware, you have the ability to write that customization, bring it into the platform. And in the case of Magento, you can write it in a way that if another engineer comes on their team, it's predictable, right? There's a format, there's a standard, there's a plugin play API for building Magento plugins, and everybody kind of understands how that works.
And so Shopware, I'm not super familiar with. I know at least one person who works there who I met at Meet Magento, and I met Ben Marks at Meet Magento, and wearing his Shopware t-shirt. But I honestly don't know that much about Shopware. So other than the fact that it is open source and relatively new to the market, is there anything worth knowing for merchants today about Shopware?
It's much like Magento. It has many of the hallmarks that Magento has. I would say it's less feature complete than Magento because it's newer, right? So you always have to consider Magento is older and therefore it probably has other considerations. That is both a cost and a benefit, right? Magento has more plugins because Magento is also older. So that's really a consideration. But generally speaking, Shopware kind of started in the German market. That's really where it comes from, and they're expanding more globally. So you'll see less Shopware stores over in the US, and you'll see some in Europe, but that's primarily the focus of Shopware at the moment, but they are trying to expand their global presence.
Okay, so we'll keep tabs on that and see how they're going. Okay, so the way that you described the back-end UI, the front-end UI, and the kind of the logic in the background, that strikes me as kind of starting the conversation about composable commerce. And I'd like to touch on this a little bit, and if you could just give your own view of composable headless. Are they the same? Are they different? And kind of where that fits in the industry today, and is it the wave of the future that everyone's been talking about?
Yeah. So as the author of a Headfull front end, I feel like I'm particularly qualified to answer this. But so to answer your question, headless and composable are different things. So headless implies that the thing, whatever it is, doesn't have a front end to it. That's really what that means. So when I say a Headfull front end, that means I'm talking about the thing that the user interacts with. Now, importantly, like we kind of just mentioned, that user could both very well be the customer, right? Could be the person who wants to buy the thing, or similarly, it could be the admin person who's trying to interact and add products to the site, all those kinds of things. So you can have a headless front end for your admin panel. You can also have a headless front end for your customers. So different use cases. A Headfull front end, and then just for terminology purposes.
You don't like the term headless?
No, I think it's unclear. I think there's some vagueness. The composable doesn't help either.
Yeah.
'Cause it's
Oh,
both
I thought Composable was a solution to that problem. I never liked Headless, so but I thought Composable was a much better.
Uh, I decoupled, I think is probably the best way
Okay.
to say it. So
Yeah.
if we talk about a decoupled front end, couple is an important word in there because it implies a pair. So you have the front end and the back end, and that's a couple. Now you can have multiple front ends and one back end, and each one of them individually, front end to back end, is a couple. So decoupled front end from back end,
Yep.
headless, headful.
Okay.
But Composable is slightly different. The front end, the thing your business users or your consumers are operating with, talks to this headless thing, just talks to something. In many cases, it's Magento or it's Shopify or it's Shopware or BigCommerce. But Composable is not about one singular platform, but rather this thing doesn't have to just be Magento. That thing could be Magento, and in a ridiculous situation, and Shopware. Could be Magento and BigCommerce. It could be Magento and Contentful. It could be Magento and HubSpot, or Magento and really whatever thing. So the basic idea is just composition of all of these kind of best-in-class features from many different companies into a unified product. And that's really where composable commerce comes from. So you take a lot of composable things, a lot of different services that have best-in-class features, and then you stick a front end, a headful front end on top of that headless thing, and poof, you have headful front end, headless commerce, and the back end behind that is composable commerce.
The word poof. I think there might be some depth to that word. There might be something more in that word.
Quite a bit, yeah, quite a bit, because it could be REST, it could be GraphQL, it could be a million different things.
It's very interesting to me that this concept, this architecture, has taken on such a trendiness, so that when I'm talking to a prospect who knows their stuff well enough, and they say, we're really planning to go headless or composable in the next 5 years, and we need someone to help us get there. And I look at what they're doing, and they are exclusively US, they are exclusively B2C. They don't have very complex selling processes. And I look at it and I wonder, is this really the right fit for them? It is very trendy. It's something that a lot of people want to talk about. It seems logically like, you're distributing all of your function. You can develop it in without impacting everything else. You can do an update here, an update over here. You can adjust the API to get more data in where you need it. It's much faster. But it also strikes me as like, this is a pretty complex architecture that we're talking about. So why is it that everyone's talking about it? Because to me, what I frequently bump up against with clients and prospects is, oh my gosh, this is going to cost so much money. And we're dealing with the monolith with Magento. And they're still struggling with, oh my gosh, we have to pay the developer to do this and this and this. And then I think about this composable architecture and I think to myself, gosh, like, who is this for? Like the billion-dollar companies that you were referring to earlier? Or is there any composable architecture that maybe in 5 years will be suitable for a mid-market enterprise business?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. It's a question that I've been working on for around 4 or 5 years now, since I started Daffodil. But the question of composable commerce is, it's great to have all of this composition, right? It's great to be able to pick and choose services that fit together nicely. But if we want to draw a parallel problem, imagine the services, all of these composable things, imagine they're just different printers, right? So imagine each one, whether or not it's HubSpot or whatever, imagine they're just different printers at your house, and you have 1,000 of them. If the wire for each of those printers was different, and the jack on the back of your computer was different, you would be annoyed if someone went and unplugged all of the jacks from both devices. You have to figure out where the wire is going, what's connecting. You can imagine that situation would be a mess, right? With composable commerce, really what the e-commerce community is trying to do is come up with a standard, right? Just like the jack for a printer is a USB, or if you're Apple, maybe it's some weird thing. But you have a USB or USB-C. We're trying to come up with whatever that standard model is. And this is something that I've been trying to solve with Daffodil, and View Storefront guys are trying to solve it with View Storefront. The Commerce Tools are guys are trying to solve it with Commerce Tools. Whatever that standard is, get everyone in the community to agree upon it, and then we move forward from there. So you have this standard, and behind the standard is all of the composition, right? So if we want to talk about computers and talk about like printers and things, it's just a basic driver, right? So Windows has a plug and play driver for printers. You just plug the printer in and poof, you can print. That poof again, same complex topic. That driver code is really where the interesting things lie, right? So composable commerce is great so long as you have a standardized interface upon which to operate. That's what the whole composable commerce discussion is. I would argue if you're going to go with like commerce tools because you think you're doing composable commerce, you kind of are, but until Commerce Tools changes their API, or until HubSpot, which is one of the backing services of Commerce Tools, changes their API. The process will repeat again and again and again until we all agree upon a standard. Similarly, if Magento does this kind of in a silo, same problem, View Storefront silo. Composable commerce is an attempt by each of these individual companies to try and build a standard, and then in turn, when you start with 1,000 standards, and then each company tries to build an additional standard, now you have 1,010 standards. So it's just an attempt. There's something called the Mock Alliance, which you may or may not be familiar with, which is trying to do this over in Europe. We don't have really a US counterpart to this yet, but there has been some discussions about how do we build an e-commerce standard so that we don't have to deal with all of this ridiculous complexity.
Right. So when I think about the standard, I think API. And that's not the standard itself, though. That's just the method, right? And then an API can be achieved using either, and tell me if I'm wrong, React, GraphQL, Vue. Is that correct? Or
no, a little bit off. So think about a simple example of an API could very well be, let's imagine like you have a person. A person has a first name and a last name. Well, maybe I don't like first names and last names. I just like the name, right? I just want, if I have a person thing, it's just name. But over the guys in Europe are like, yeah, we like first name and last name. Let's keep it like that. Well, now the two standards need to talk to one another. Well, I need to take the first name and last name from Europe and put a space between them and then poof its name over here. And now we can have a way to communicate between the things.
I see.
Take that same core idea, expand it to all of the different kinds of data which exist in e-commerce. So it's first names and last names on the customers, the name of an item in the cart, the name of a product, the brand, like the brand field on a product, the UPC code, right? Take all of these complex ideas. If we don't have a unified interface, none of these systems can talk to each other, and it's really complicated, and everything has to have like an individual wire plugged into it for that particular need.
So it's like a mapping.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it is.
Okay.
So composable commerce is an attempt to build a mapping.
Okay. And the standardization, I mean, you're never going to get everyone to agree field 1 matches field A and field 2 matches field B. Like, you're never going to get that to be standardized across to every e-commerce provider. So the standardization that you're talking about is related to what then?
So it's an external thing. So Commerce Tools, for example, is an external layer on top of all of these different providers to try and build that standard, whatever it is. And then if they get enough market share, they are the standard. That is the standard. You must meet this standard. It's just an attempt at standardization. Same thing with the View Storefront, right? Same thing I'm doing with Daffodil. You attempt to build a standard, house all of the complexity behind it, and then as a result, everyone can use your platform. And I could have, there are a lot of crazy things you could do, but you can have like one front end for a bunch of different stores. You could have a bunch of different things.
Okay. I don't want this to turn into like me learning, because this is a very interesting topic to me, and I don't have as much knowledge in this area, so I'm always very interested in learning more. But we can table that and discuss that later. We want to stay focused on the future of e-commerce. So this is going to remain an important part, I assume, given that you're working so hard on Daffodil for now and the future. Is it eventually going to find the standardization and come down in price and be more approachable to merchants who may want an alternative to SaaS or a monolith?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so there will definitely come a point in time, first of all, because there has been no standard, all of the standardization companies have to build their own standard, which means they have to repeat all of the features that everyone else did. So there's like a time of R&D. And then once we accomplish that, there is some standard. And then once that happens, everyone has to come to terms and say, okay, this is the standard. There will come a time in the future, I think probably within the next 5 years. I think 10 is a bit far, where that standard is agreed upon, and we don't really have this problem so much anymore.
I'll look forward to it. Okay, good. I think we've touched on all of the components that I wanted to touch on. I guess, as we promised early on in the conversation, you mentioned Mage-OS, and we've already talked a little bit about Adobe and Magento Open Source. But can you talk a little bit more about what I'll call the politics and the kind of wrangling that's going on there? Where does Mage-OS fit? Magento Association, Adobe Commerce. Like, I don't want to get too political about it, but this is a topic that's been very active on LinkedIn, I'd say, within the echo chamber of the industry. I don't know that merchants really care. They just want something that works. But sure, we are all buzzing about this, and I'd love to get your take on this, but specifically about Mage-OS, because I don't think many people know exactly what that is.
Yeah, so Mage-OS is a fork of Magento. It is currently it is a perfect fork of Magento, which means it is exactly the same. We publish a mirror of Magento. And in fact, we actually do a little bit more than that. We actually publish a nightly of Magento. So if you wanted to check whether or not your store is compatible with the version of Magento as of today and not wait for the beta or not wait for the next release, which is currently in March, you can actually do that. So if you can imagine you're an extension vendor and you're trying to publish extensions, you want to check, is my extension compatible with what's coming? You can do that. So we have built all of the tooling to rebuild Magento from its source code to something that merchants can use. And that's the current state. So right now we're a mirror, but over the next couple of months, what we're going to start to do is accept pull requests from the community, allowing the community to build a separate Magento. It will still be Magento at its core. We actually merge the code base that Adobe publishes every single day whenever they do a merge. So we constantly keep up to date with what they're doing. And then we're going to be figuring out the process of, well, what happens if our changes conflict with Adobe's changes? What do we do? We have a strong preference for backwards compatibility. So the goal is to basically take Magento Open Source and let the community control it as opposed to like letting Adobe control it.
So why? You've got Adobe Commerce, you've got Magento Open Source, and as you said, those two seem to be kind of moving in slightly different directions. So why not just go all in on Magento Open Source and say, like, this is the thing, and we're going to take our community energy and put it behind Magento Open Source, rather than creating this mirror, which will eventually become its own fork, to have a third path, which for merchants, honestly, they're already confused. They've been confused with Magento since 2017, to be perfectly honest. So this is not doing them any favors, but I'm just wondering why do you feel we need to move in this direction?
Yeah, it's a really hard question, but the answer lies in kind of one key area. How long does it take for me to fix a bug in Magento, give it to Adobe, and have that show up in the merchant's code base? If you kind of had to guess a number, a time, I'd give approximate.
3 months.
No, far off. 1.5 years on average. So That makes a developer annoyed, right? Why? So there are a couple of problems. The first is I submit the fix, right? I go through the pain and the effort to not only fix the bug, so find the bug, fix the bug, and then I have to write tests to make sure that the bug can't come up ever again. I submit it to Adobe for review. The first thing that happens is it never gets looked at. So they have a robot which will go through unreviewed pull requests and close them. So I submit the fix. The first thing that happens is my fix gets closed without, I submitted the fix, no one reviewed it, it got closed. So then I upsetly go reopen it. Once again, to repeat this process until the bot closes it again, or I interrupt the bot and say, please don't close this. Maybe a year goes by, and then someone reviews it, and then the process of trying to get it merged starts. But that requires a couple of things. So the first thing is that Adobe needs to agree, first of all, that the bug exists. Funny thing is, well, most of the time the bug exists, the merchant ran into it, you fixed it. So Adobe has to agree that it exists. And then secondarily to that, Adobe has to agree that it impacts them, right? Because it's their code base, they control it.
Yeah.
I don't. And this is the problem for the community. We want to be able to merge pull requests, which improve our lives, right? Improve our day-to-day lives, improve the merchant's code base, right? No one wants bugs. And additionally, Adobe never merges new features that the community submits, so good luck with that. The merchant wants new features too. And the merchant would love to have new features provided by the platform that they didn't have to have their dev team write. And this is the core tenet of MageOS. So I was not one of the original signers of what was called the Open Source Community Alliance. It's a letter that a group of devs submitted last year. But we all kind of grew frustrated. And in that frustration, we found energy. We want to build cool things. And I don't want to wait a year and a half to build cool things. I will say in the past 2 months, I have done more interesting things with Mage-OS than I have done with Magento in 4 years.
Wow.
And that's really the power of the community versus the power of waiting for a pull request.
The reasons are clear. And I hope that the community continues to grow around Mage-OS. It sounds like I mean, we are very much aligned philosophically with the open source ideas and the origins of Magento, and we like the idea of that fork moving forward. So I hope that it gains more traction. I think is it primarily in Europe or maybe more well-known in Europe than it is in the US?
I would say at the moment, yeah. Generally speaking, Magento tends to have a somewhat more European focus, even though it's a US-based company. But yeah, it definitely has more of a European focus. But one of the board members works for a company called Paradox Labs up in Pennsylvania. So it's definitely got a US footprint. Like I myself am in Richmond, Virginia. So there are people from all around the globe who are a part of it. It's not it may have more of a European focus, but there's definitely a US footprint as well.
Well, this is a little bit off track from the future of e-commerce, but Magento is a core component of that industry, and I think it's relevant to talk about the future of Magento and Adobe Commerce, and MageOS seems to be one of the likely candidates of what that future holds. Separate, of course, but definitely related. So just to wrap up our conversation about the future of e-commerce, I'm curious to hear if you have any ideas of particular innovations or maybe things that you expect to be happening over the next few years that people should be paying attention to related to e-commerce?
There are some interesting things that are somewhat related to the standardization thing that I think are interesting. There are, if we want to speak to some of the things that Adobe is doing, I think are interesting. So if you haven't seen App Builder, which is their kind of new thing they're working towards, basically like drag and drop e-commerce. I don't want to say it's like Squarespace, it's like Wix. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But they're trying to build something which is more complex, and it solves more complicated use cases, but is super performant. So that is the future. You're going to see a lot more standardization, not standardization, but rather like servicitization, microservicitization of various feature areas of e-commerce into either separate companies. So you might find someone who does search really well, like Algolia is an example of this. Or you might find someone who does product recommendations really well. So you give them your product recommendation feed and they'll spit back product recommendations. So I would say the servitization, or the carving apart of various feature areas of e-commerce, is something to look for. And that's the composable commerce.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, great. So when we publish this, we'll be sure to include in the show notes your information, how people can reach you. Find you on LinkedIn, I assume. Are you active on any of the other social channels, or is that a good place for folks to find you?
Yeah, I mean, so you can always find me on GitHub, github.com/DamienWebDev. That's DAMIEN, web, W-E-B, dev, D-E-V. Same thing for Twitter. I'm on the same handle as well. If you want to look me up on LinkedIn, it's just Damien Retzinger. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today. This is great because it's a different perspective than what we've had in our other conversations, much more technical centric, which I appreciate, and I think our merchants who have the internal technical chops will also appreciate. I think we might have in our future, Damien, a conversation about Daffodil and Mage-OS to dig into those a little bit more, partially because I'd like to support those ideas and help expose them to more people, but also just because I love to learn about those technologies as well. So thank you for sharing your insights with us today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.